The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. The following video is presented by the Center for Educational Media in partnership with Professional Educators of Tennessee's Leader U Conference. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today we're going to be talking about why Tennessee needs more educators of color. If you're a teacher, and depending on where you are, you might recognize that there is a mismatch between the racial diversity with the students that we're serving in correlation to the educators that are in front of them every day. And up until this point, I spent the last 5 years in the classroom, and I can honestly say from the time I started moving forward, that conversation has gotten deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And it's gotten to the point where we were doing a lot of acknowledging, continuing acknowledgement of the issue. And more recently, within the last couple of years, we're starting to see a little bit more movement with actions to try to push this forward with some solutions-oriented ideas. So let's jump into this. I like to start off with a clip. This is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but I think it frames, short clip, but I think it frames the ideal and the notion of needing future teachers of color in classrooms. So.
I tell my students all the time, people don't become successful on their own. There's always someone that's been there to help them, that has been there before them, that has seen the path and seen the vision. The relationship that I have with Mr. Harpole has been phenomenal. And it's gone beyond just the scholarship that I got. It's because of his contribution to my education that I am able to educate other people. Primarily all of my students that I teach are people of color. And so for a lot of them, they tell me that I'm the first African-American male teacher they've ever had, that they're students that I've had before because of just me being here in this presence that tell me each and every day that I am the reason why they come to school. So that they can see me and they can come to my hour and they enjoy being in my classroom. I feel like UWM did a really good job and does a really good job with urban education, giving students a practical view of what stepping into an urban high school is like. I wanted to be a person that could give more to my community, and I feel like teaching does that for me. Teaching gives me the ability to look at Milwaukee and see hope and change. People of color are needed in schools today. I cannot stress to you enough how we need leaders that are here, and not just people of color in general, but people of color that care for these kids. And for people that decide to be teachers, it's a very rewarding job.
Let me kind of frame this a little bit. I transitioned into a role with the National Teacher Residency in May to be their Director of Recruitment. The National Teacher Residency has a premium on wanting to recruit, particularly anybody, but they have a premium wanting to recruit people of color. They want to put people of color in schools in Nashville. And for me, that spoke volumes to me. I was like, wow, that's an awesome job. That's something right up my alley anyways. So let me preface this. We're gonna kind of frame up from a universal standpoint in the United States of where we are, educators of color, students of color, transition to Tennessee. But then we're also gonna talk about some of those barriers. This is going to be somewhat of me presenting a little bit, but I'm not going to talk the whole time. We're going to have a conversation because the reason we need to have the conversation is simply we're in a state that is urban, suburban, and rural. And this could look vastly different depending on where you are. So we can't say, hey, we're going to have a one-size-fits-all approach and try to resolve this issue. This is not something that will happen overnight either. So I think I need to be candid on both of those two parts. However, I do have some suggestions on what I think, just from my perspective of being an educator of color and a former student of color, and then transition into a role where I'm now trying to recruit educators of color of how we can work together to, again, it's not going to be overnight, but make some intentional efforts to try to mirror the educated population with our student population in Tennessee. So just to give you a little background story of me, story of an educator of color, former student of color. So for me, I'm originally from Florida. My parents divorced. My family were stationed in the military, my aunt and uncle at Fort Campbell in Clarksville. So we moved from Florida to Clarksville. Moved there, we were very unstable. I went to a different school every year from 3rd grade until I got to high school. Every year I went to a different school. I went to 6 different schools every year, switch. And it didn't dawn on me till probably my junior year that I never seen a person of color as a teacher in the building. I never had the luxury of experiencing a person of color as a teacher in the building. I got that luxury my junior year in high school for one semester, my keyboarding teacher. And it was a little different. She was not like, I definitely knew that I was in a classroom with a person of color. And it's probably what I needed at the time. Fast forwarding, I am not a educator by trade. My background was in business. I graduated from college, worked in the business field for about 6 or 7 years, transitioned to work in a higher ed role in an enrollment recruitment position, and then started a doctorate at Trevecca after being laid off at the university. And that's where I met my assistant principal, who told me they needed a business teacher at the high school. Now, I taught in the district that I went to school in, but those was invisible lines. It's one side of town and there's another side of town. I lived on one side of town and went to one school, professionally taught on the other side of town. I taught at a very affluent high school. For 5 years, I was the only male person of color in the building. There were 5 other people there, 3 Hispanics who all taught Spanish, 2 African-American, 1 taught cosmetology, 1 taught English. But I was the only male person of color present in the building for the 5 years that I was there. Actually, for 4 years. The 1 year after I started, the ROTC instructor retired early. So that was my life. I lived, I breathed, I ate that for so long. And it didn't dawn on me until maybe a week would go by, and then we have a faculty meeting, and then I would see somebody of color at the meeting, but I never saw them during the day. Once that bell rung, it was bell to bell. We started the day, we went bell to bell, and we were strictly focusing on trying to do our job in the classroom, monitoring the hallways, and things that around that nature that were around our rooms. But having that collegial moments where you're budding and talking, and that didn't exist. The only time I really got that was at faculty meetings, district pullouts, or if I came to Nashville for a conference. And even when I came, I still always recognized that, wow, like there's a lack of diversity when you go to these conferences, a lack of diversity when you go into certain spaces. And I couldn't understand why that existed. I'm thinking to myself, but then I had to reflect on my own personal experience as a student, and that's when it dawned on me that, hey, education looks the same exact way as I'm teaching it that it did when I went through public education K-12. My personal experience. So that's the reason why I started looking at getting involved in fellowships. I wanted to see what else was beyond the classroom. So I began to apply for different fellowships because I wanted to see, I don't know that I want to be in the classroom forever because it just started to feel uncomfortable. So I started applying for these fellowships. I ended up getting accepted to all of these different fellowships. And when I got into these leadership fellowships, my experience in the leadership fellowships was the same thing as it was in my building. I walk into these rooms, I walk into these spaces, and it'd be just me, and most of the time. Or it might be 1 or 2 other people, but most of the time it was just me. And I realized that this was a problem that was just not in my building or a district. It was just across the state in some pockets, in some areas. So we're going to go ahead and just dive in and start looking at a couple of things and addressing how this looks universally, nationwide. On the left side here, you usually see this is a comparison of white educators to non-white educators, white educators and people of color. In the United States, with educators, 18% of us are people of color. 82% are white educators. Diversity-wise, within the United States, we have more students of color than we have white students. By just a little bit, 50.1. That just took place within the last year and a half that we kind of tipped the pot. But the interesting story behind this is like 30 years ago, educators of color only made up 13% of the education population. So in 30 years, we've moved the needle 5%, 30 years. However, that number has grown astronomically. 30 years ago, this was 35% students of color. So ideally, what they're predicting, the National Center for Education Statistics predicts that by 2024, that number where white students will be about 45, and students of color is going to continue to increase. And if we stay at the rate that we've been increasing over the last 30 years, that needle's not going to move that much. It might move 1%. So that disparity is still going to exist. It's not, if anything, it's going to get wider. That's the reason why we have to be more intentional about how we're trying to get people of color into the profession. So, why is this even important? Why even worry about this? Why does this even matter? Studies show if you have one black teacher and you're a student in either your 3rd to 5th grade and you're a student of color, this reduces the dropout rate, the chance that you're going to drop out by 39%. You'll be 10% more likely to take the ACT more than once. As you know, in Tennessee, we normally test the ACT one time when you're a junior. You're more than likely going to be more encouraged to take it again should you not score a score to your liking. And then you're 10% more likely to complete a first year of some type of post-secondary education. The student population is increasing. The student population is increasing and we're doing nothing or nothing more than what we've done, then that disparity increases. There's job shortages. Now, I don't know how many people were here for Ryan's keynote this morning, which he did a phenomenal job. Shout out to Ryan Jackson. But he put a graphic up there that gave this display of all these jobs that are having shortages. He didn't mention teachers. We're having a shortage. Every year from now to 2022, and this is in the state of Tennessee. Just in the state of Tennessee, we're looking to predict to have anywhere between 2,000 to 2,500 jobs unfilled. You know how many counties start the school year with long-term subs? Last year, they said Shelby County started with 100 unfilled positions. So that means that there's 100, either a long-term sub or a sub switching out every few days or every few weeks. Kids probably not getting quality instruction that in the long term only hurts the children. We have to start being a champion of the profession and recognize that, hey, like, we have a job shortage too. Like, we also need that love, tender care, and affection, and that promotion to identify that this is also a profession where people can actually have some value and be a global citizen in society. Role models and cultural brokers. Students of color deserve to see people like them. Unfortunately, and I'll tell you this, outside of the teacher that I had, the next time I saw a person of color as a professional was when I went to college. I had a college professor, and that was my sophomore year in college. I did not see, and I think for some of our students, the profession that they see at school are probably some of the few that they see within probably that span while they're in school, you know, outside of maybe doctor visits. But I didn't see any doctors of color, lawyers of color, even at one point, you know, firemen of color, police of color. And then I sure didn't see it in the space where I spent 6 to 8 hours of my day for those 13 years that I was in K-12 on a daily basis, even in a building. And I think for me personally, and I will also venture to estimate for some of our students that plays a role in what we think we can and cannot accomplish. I knew for a fact that the reason why when I went to college, first of all, I majored in computer science. don't know what I was thinking. I was what we call tripping. But Memphis State at the time, before it was University of Memphis, came to our school, and they had this list of the hot jobs. And this was early 2000. I'm early 2000 graduate. If you go on these jobs, you're gonna make money. That's the only thing I was thinking in my mind, because that's what we grew up without. We grew up living pillar to post for a couple years, living out of a car for a couple years. So money was like, man, if I get money, I drill down money, that's gonna solve the problem. So I'm gonna go to school and major in money. And that's what I did. Never met a computer engineer, computer scientist. I just saw money. I saw green. But that was the influence of what it had to me. Outside of that, I don't know what I would have done. You could have probably told me to major anything. I would have probably just tried it if you would have told me it was attached to money. But it played a role. I knew for a fact I wasn't going to be a teacher, because most of the teachers that I met, they unfortunately, especially with this issue with the job shortages, they dumbed down the profession. You had people in front of students who did champion the profession. They dumbed down the profession. So they were driving students away without even knowing. So that was checked off my list. Like, no, I'm not going to do that. I didn't want to be military because my dad was retired Navy. And my stepdad was in the Army. So I'm like, I'm not going to be military. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to college, and I'm going to try to make some money. That was my goal. And a lot of kids, they don't even have college on their radar in some aspects. But they just think about, man, what can I do outside of school so I can make life better for me, whatever that looks like for them. But they're not thinking about going into certain professions because they don't see it. There's a disconnect. Several studies also point out to increase learning with students. There's an increased learning with students that have teachers that look like them in front of them. And also, they also have more opportunities in EPSOs. That's early post-secondary opportunities. So that's like your AP classes, your dual enrollment classes. What studies have shown is that students that are sitting in front of people that look like them are more willing to give them a chance to take an AP. And districts do it differently. But in my district, the teacher made a decision whether or not you were going to go to AP, you were going to go to dual. When we had recommendation day, you made a choice. And unfortunately, when you looked at those classes through the window, you could tell who was picked to be in those classes. You could tell. Now, if you were a person who tried hard and you had some determination, you probably could have done well in that class if you were given a shot, but you were never given the shot. And that's not in every district, that's not in every school, but that is a thing that they've noticed in studies with students of color in buildings when it comes to getting early post-secondary opportunities. There's another study that says, though, if students are exposed to having those opportunities, they're more likely prompt to go to college. So we're trying to encourage people to become educators, but you strip them of the opportunity to get exposure to what the collegiate life could be like. So when you strip them of that opportunity and they never get a chance to get it, that could be the difference between me going to college or not going to college. In my mind, I could be on the fence of whether or not I'm going to go to college. But if I take a dual enrollment course or an AP course, and these are college courses that are going to yield college credit, and I passed that class because I was given the opportunity, in my mind, I'm like, hey, I did it. College may not be that bad after all. Maybe I can try. Maybe I can achieve. Maybe I can take an opportunity and take a leap and go forth. But when you're not even given the opportunity, and then you don't have a support system that's encouraging you to be able to go forth or telling you, hey, these are the opportunities and this is why you're doing some of the things that you're doing, it's probably not going to be on your radar. It's just that simple. So that brings us to Tennessee. What about Tennessee? Big TN. So we have almost 998,000 students, almost 1 million students in Tennessee. They predicted that we'll be at 1 million students in the next 5 years. 997,893 students in Tennessee. 36% of those students are students of color. That number is increasingly going up. If you look on the right side, though, here's some statistics about Tennessee. 146 districts. Out of that 146 districts, 122 of those districts do not have a single Hispanic teacher. Zero, none, nada, zilch. Then you have 27 more that don't have a single African American teacher at all. So not even just taking into consideration the 36% of students of color, but just those students in general, they're not getting exposed to a global society. Then you have approximately 65,000 teachers. The last wave of candidates that came into the profession last year 14% of them self-identify as educators of color. Out of that 998,000 students, 5% are ELL students. It's about 50,000. 35% of those students are also economically disadvantaged, and 14% of them have disabilities. So, not to mention having that many students, but a vast majority of this population are going to fall into these categories. They're going to be your EL students. They're going to be your economically disadvantaged students on free and reduced lunch. They're going to be your students with disabilities. So when we don't give them an opportunity to see themselves in the classroom, then they're also losing chances to produce and have a higher trajectory once they leave the classroom. And this kind of sets the stage of where we are. This is where we are in Tennessee. There's a lot of movement around teacher diversity and what should we do, what can we do. So before we dive into what can we do and what are some options and or some suggestions of things that we could probably implement to address this particular situation, let's just among ourselves take 2 minutes, and I had the timer mentally, to just discuss what are those barriers that are preventing us from effectively addressing and resolving this issue. What are things that are preventing us from being able to effectively resolve and address an issue of getting more racially diverse people in the classroom? If you don't mind just stating your name and what county or what you do within the education profession. I'm trying to identify. When I transitioned to Nashville, I noticed that the world got smaller. Start seeing some of the same faces. I'm like, man, it'd be good when I bump into you again, I could call you by your name and say, hey, so you got the biggest smile in the room. You don't mind just sharing your name and where you're from and some thoughts that y'all shared at the table?
Well, Vanetta Maston from Hampton County.
Chattanooga. Started at UT Chat.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we talked about a lot of things. Just maybe in high school, first of all, just letting them know that it's an option, giving them an option of, teaching is a profession you might want to go to, expose them to it. And then we also talked about the financial part. We know that when it comes to males, and it really doesn't matter what color, sometimes it's a financial thing, like you were saying, the money. They want to be providers, and sometimes teaching does it. But just show them how there are ways when you get into that field on how you can move up the things that you need to do. But that mostly inform them of it.
We talked about with the Tennessee Promise, identifying what 2-year degree.
Right, the Tennessee Promise, that they get 2 years where it's paid for. Well, let them, guide them in what kind of degree they need to get in that 2-year program, what that would lead them into the teaching profession. So those are some things we talked about.
You'll be glad that y'all talked about those things when we move forward. What y'all talk about, discuss up here?
Yes. One thing that we talked about is something that I'm an assistant principal and we're looking to hire, African American teachers, and there's very few out there. But I think a part of it is that we're not really champions of our own profession. There's not a lot of, or we may be because we're here, but there's not a lot of people that are rooting on teachers and have to respect the teachers like they used to. So you have some of the other students that look into that and you're like, I don't want to be a teacher. Where they see the work that we have to do, which is hard work, but we're willing to do it. But they're like, you all don't get paid anything, I don't want to do that. So I think that's a barrier for some of the students that they see. And I think we also talk about lack of support, sometimes, getting into the profession.
We're glad you mentioned that when you move forward. Did you have any?
My name is Will Pinner. I'm from Murray County. I think one of the things that is difficult is time. As an administrator, we often will post a job and we need to get the job filled quickly. And if there were a more systemic approach where we had time and we were actively recruiting, we might be able to address that. But like, like everything, when there's 1,000 different sort of things going on, sometimes it's easier to just whoever happens to apply, and if we don't have any applicants of color, like you mentioned, it makes it very difficult to help move that needle at all.
Absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly, and something that you mentioned, hopefully it will resonate here too in a minute. That's great. So much of what I heard is things that I've heard when I've asked these questions before, and it's affirming that I'm thinking about this the right way. We're thinking about this the right way. Especially too, since I'm transitioning to a role where this is what I'm going to be doing. So I'm trying to think like, okay, is it just me? It's not just me. It's people. We're thinking about this the right way, and these are legitimate barriers that are preventing us from being able to transition. Now, what we need to do is start having that conversation of what can we do to move the needle. So that's where we are right now. I think the first thing we have to do. The first thing that we have to do, absolutely, is just be realistic. Be realistic, but be intentional. The realism of the situation, like this is not something that's going to change overnight. It took a long time for this particular situation to occur and develop. It's going to take some time for us to start addressing it in a meaningful way. What's going to help us is being intentional and strategic about how we go about doing it. For a long time, we've been publicly, some venues and areas have been acknowledging it. I can tell you now that talks about diversity and culture don't always take place in some buildings at all. Like those conversations aren't taking place. And for many people, as a building leader, administrative leader in a building, it's almost a direct reflection of leadership in some places, because you do hiring, you set the culture for the building, and then teachers are responsible for setting that climate culture in classrooms. But we have to be realistic about it, and just to your point is that sometimes you have to be realistic to the point that the candidacy pool may not be there. If I have a candidate that's here that's qualified, although I want to be and create this diverse culture and climate, I don't have that candidacy pool to pull from, or even the interview. You got to fill the spot. Or, unfortunately, you leave the spot unfilled, and you get a long-term sub in there, or you get somebody in there every few days, and it's a detriment to kids. So, transitioning from that being realistic and being intentional, part of the being intentional and being strategic part is the partnerships with ed prep providers. I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Amy Wooten in the Office of Licensure Ed Preparation at the department last summer when I did my Education Pioneers Fellowship. And one of my tasks was working on an initiative that they started with the community of practice and partnerships that some institutions and districts in Eastern Tennessee, Northeastern Tennessee have really latched onto and done a really good job with. But it's this idea that there's conversations that are taking place between districts and ed prep providers that filter into those districts. So when I'm at a point where I know already that a teacher's retiring or somebody may be moving, I'm gonna need a chemistry teacher, I'm gonna need a biology teacher, I'm gonna need an English teacher, I'm gonna need a math teacher. I'm already in communication, having shared conversations with the EPP or the ed prep provider that's filtering into my district, and I can try to position myself to be prepared. At some point, you should be able to have a conversation with an ed prep provider and be like, okay, how many candidates do you have graduating this semester? Out of those candidates, how many of those candidates are math? How many of those candidates are ELA? How many of those candidates are chemistry, biology, elementary ed? And then taking it a step further, how many of those candidates are people of color? Because they're going to have to report that now. As you all most know, the state board released their report card for ed prep providers. That information is available, public. But it shouldn't get to that detriment to where I have to go, and it should be an ongoing conversation where we're having intentional meetings and we're talking about this. And we're taking those conversations and we're using that as a planning tool to be able to fill positions within our district and within our buildings in the district. There should be some conversation. Is there anybody here who has close connections to ed prep providers, the administrative roles, or in classroom, that these conversations have already began?
I've never heard of partnerships with ed prep providers. We go through our recruit, our recruitment directors, but we have had those conversations. If this is something that's all over the state of Tennessee, I don't know.
So they piloted this, but what they were saying was based off of the pilot, just people could just pick it up and just run with it. Like it was almost one of those things was like, you don't have to have permission to be able to have those conversations with ed prep providers. But it was almost a shock to me as I was compiling research and trying to figure out like, what districts had these conversations. One example, I'm off the top of my head, Knox County had a good relationship with UT Knoxville, and they were using EdTPA well before it's coming down the pipeline to where it's going to be implemented where everybody's going to have to use it. They were using it already, and they were having people in district communicating with people at UT Knox, and they had somewhat of a relationship to try to address some of those things before they got out of line as far as filling positions with upcoming graduates that are at least in a position to kind of say, hey, like this is how many people would graduate in this class who will be teach this. And then districts been able to kind of see where they were with the schools in the districts as far as, okay, we're going to lose this many teachers to retirement or move or what have you. So those, I'm pretty sure most schools do those reports at the end of the year where they say, hey, what's your plans for next year? Taking those plans and being intentional and say, hey, I know I'm losing these teachers who've already communicated with me, and being intentional with having those conversations to try to figure out what the game plan was to be able to fill those slots once they were vacant. This could work in the same favor, in the same breath, in the same vein with educators of color. If you know enough, if you have a good enough relationship, an established relationship, you can start having those conversations. I don't know how, and I guess that's the thing because there's some schools that filter into several districts. And that might be some research to figure out, like who is our primary EPP and if you look at the State Board of Education Ed Preparation Report, what they've done now is like if you click on does everybody know what I'm talking about? They released a website that reports for every education preparation provider. If you look at it, like you click on the name of the ed prep provider, it'll tell you the areas that ed prep provider is servicing. It'll also show you, it ranks the programs on profile candidacy or candidacy profile, so how diverse the cohorts are. It ranks them on how well those people who graduated from their programs are performing in the classrooms. It also is ranking them on how well they have prepared those people to take jobs in the state or where have they. So it's interesting if you look at it, but in that same breath, you can use it as a tool for preparation to address this. To your table, start early. I'm a huge fan of the ideal of starting early. How many people have heard of Educators Rising? It's a movement that started in California. It's kind of taking the educator field by storm a little bit. But what it is it is a organization that is advocating for students to get an early start down an educator path while they're in high school. So familiar with micro-credentialing? Micro-credentialing is a new digital platform. It's almost going to probably take the place of some of the professional developments that we do. Micro-credentialing is, you can go on there, it's almost like somewhat of an online course, but the evidence that you have to submit in order to complete the micro-credentials sometimes extensive. It's really specific. But they have micro-credentials set up to where if you are a high school student and you're a part of this organization, you can take these micro-credentialing programs and you can gain these credits that prove that you are working towards being an educator. And some of those credits will transition to college credit depending on the area you're in and if the school will take the micro-credential as college credit. They're an organization that is heavily working to move high school students down the educator path. Future Teachers of America, equipping high school, very talented high school kids, not only to be future educators, but also giving them time to be mentors to elementary kids. Both of those, huge. We had Future Teachers of America when I was in high school. We did not have one at the school I taught the last 5 years. And then this is a new movement. This is just within the last few years that this one has become available. But the other thing, to your point of championing the profession, starting early, my district, we started having career academies around business. We had career academies around automotive. We had career academies around STEM. We had career academies around everything that we felt was important to the community that we lived in. We didn't have a teacher career academy. We didn't have a teacher career academy. And knowing, and we know that we are statewide at a deficit and we need teachers. That's a prime opportunity to get all students of color, students not of color, an opportunity to get exposure to the profession before they get to the point of having to make that prime decision in college. They could be, and the way, I know Nashville has career academies, but the way career academies were set up in the district that I taught in, most of those career academies were attached to early post-secondary opportunities. So there was some type of AP course, some type of dual enrollment course that those students could take that showed that to give them a little more exposure to what a collegiate course would look like for them if they decide to go down that path. I taught in the business academy. I taught dual financial planning and dual accounting. I was an accounting teacher. We gave those students those opportunities. That way they would know, hey, if I decide to go down this route and really pursue business, this is what it feels like. These are some early exposures that way I can make a decision. So starting early and giving kids an opportunity to have exposure is prime. Like, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, because it's almost a 2-for-1. They get exposure to the profession, 1, and then 2, they get exposure to some form of post-secondary education that they may not have been able to get exposed to had they not been in either one of these organizations or a part of a career academy. So these are conversations that could easily, like this right here, you can start either one of these at schools. If you're a classroom teacher, you can start one of those in your building. This is probably a bigger movement where it's going to be more of a district decision if you want to go down a career academy path. And particularly, most of the career academies are at the secondary, the high school level. There are some that I've seen on the West Coast that start middle school, 8th grade, you can start. But those are options for giving those students of color an opportunity to be exposed to education, and particularly making an early decision if they want to go down that path. Alternate licensure paths, super important. All these schools that are listed here, Cumberland University, Lipscomb, Memphis Teacher Residency, Teach for America Memphis, Teach for America Nashville, the New Teacher Project, Union University. When the Ed Preparation Report released from the State Board of Education, schools were ranked overall on a scale from 1 to 4. And the categories they were ranked on were, again, the diversity of the cohorts that they were producing, how well they prepared the candidates, and how well those candidates performed on state assessments after they left the program and entered the classroom. All of these schools that are listed here receive 4s. They receive the highest marks on that first wave of the report card. Here's the caveat. Research has shown that alternate licensure paths have been a huge developer of racially diverse candidates into the profession. So most of the people who are in the profession within the last 6 to 8 years that are of color, most of them came from alternate licensure routes. It just happens to be that all of these schools here, ed prep providers, were not only 4s on the report card, but also the ed licensure paths, alternate licensure paths, the Memphis Teacher Residency, both of the Teach for America, and then the New Teacher Project. In Tennessee, these particular ed prep providers, among all of their candidates that they had in their programs, had the highest percentage of racial diversity. So it's proving what's stated in the studies nationwide that alternate licensure providers are producing educators of color. It's the same thing in Tennessee. Some of those barriers that people of color are facing getting into the profession, the alternate licensure paths are removing some of them. And that's what's allowing them the opportunity to get into the profession. You mentioned back there earlier about money. Most of these licensure, alternate licensure programs, at least the ones I know that are the residency model and Teach for America and the National Teaching Fellows, they provide some stipend for these individuals as they're going through the program. I know, it's not listed up there because they don't have any data, but National Teacher Residency, we provide a stipend, at least $25,000 as you learn to teach over the course of a year. All those other models are structured somewhat the same way. They've given people money. They tried to take the financial aspect off the table, because for most people, if it comes down to taking care of your family or being able to provide financially and having a student teach for a semester or what, that's a hard decision to make for somebody. What if you're a mid-career professional, you want to enter the education profession, they say, hey, you're in a traditional program or your program requires you the student teaching. They say, hey, we really don't want you to work while you're student teaching. Your options are to still work at night somewhere and hope they don't find out, or if you're working, probably quit your job or make that sacrifice to make it work out for those couple months that you have to student teach. That's a burden. And these alternate licensure paths have removed some of that. It's not perfect, but removed it for the length of time that people are going to go through those programs and put them in a position to where they could take some of that stress off their plate so that they can transition into the education profession. So again, alternate licensure programs across the country are the biggest developers of educators of color. And in the state of Tennessee, these alternate licensure programs, specifically the MTR and the Teach for America and the New Teacher Project, they're doing the same exact thing. Within their cohorts, they have the highest racial diversity among all of the other ed prep programs in the state. So this is definitely an option. And again, when thinking about being strategic and saying, hey, we want to make partnerships with ed prep programs, a lot of these organizations have schools that they filter into. A lot of them are looking for partner schools. Hey, we're looking for a partner school to filter our residents into, or we're looking for a partner school to filter our teachers into after they complete our program. Having those conversations and building those connections could be a prime opportunity to get some of those teachers in your building. The other thing, and probably one of the last things that I can think of that's really powerful, is campaigns. Did anybody hear about the Teach Today, Change Tomorrow campaign? Anybody familiar with that? That was a campaign that was started by SCORE. SCORE is the state collaborative of reform and education based here in Nashville. They do a lot of work around ed policy. And this is a campaign that they started to try to connect with millennials and give them resources and insight to help them transition or make a decision to want to be an educator. So they do have a website. You could Google that. It'll pull up. They have a website. There's testimonials from current educators at the time when they were running the campaign. I had provided a testimonial and kind of told my story and how I transitioned into the space. In addition to the testimonials, there's resources. It tells you what the average salary is across the state. It also breaks down to specific counties and districts what salaries are. It tells the impact that educators have in the environments, particularly in Tennessee. And then also it kind of gets a little specific when it talks about specific districts. And then there's those testimonials that are available there too as well. They also have, if you want to just promote education and be a champion for it, they have little infographics that you can print off, put in your rooms. If you're having those conversations, if you have those future Teach for America clubs at your school or starting them, or if you wanted to start an Educator Rising club in your school, they have resources that are available to help promote the education profession to these younger students, middle school, high school. And then also this particular, they were particularly trying to get high school students, but they also were targeting some of the recent graduate millennials too as well. So my thing with this is I like this campaign. When it started out, they were doing Twitter, Instagram, they were doing several different social medias, and it started off, you could see on Instagram, the likes ticking up. It started off with like a few hundred, and then over the course of a couple of weeks, they were in the tens of thousands, and then almost notching up now closer to the 100,000. So people were seeing the ads. It was visible. My thing is that you could take this same concept and create an ask, but be specific and say, hey, we're looking for educators of color. They took the concept where, now what they've done is they've highlighted that, and they've acknowledged in their campaign that there's a need for more racially diverse teachers within the profession in Tennessee. But I mean, you could take a campaign a step further and just be specific and say, hey, we need more educators of color within the profession. And in the same way that they were taking testimonies of teachers in the profession, you could take testimonies from current educators of color in the profession. And do the same exact thing, but just be more specific and creating a sense of need around having those individuals in classrooms in front of students. So this is a clip of a campaign that they ran in Oregon, trying to recruit and attract people of color to the profession. And they themed it around just why students need to be able to see educators of color in front of them.
Because race informs so much of people's lives, whether they realize it or not, it's that much more important to bring in educators who look like the students we're serving. Oftentimes, students of color, just like their teachers, are navigating and inhabiting multiple worlds. Being able to navigate those worlds fluidly is important, and students need to see that.
Because we're seeing more diverse classrooms, and we need to make sure that the faces of the teachers are matching the students.
And teachers do more than just teach content. They really are role models. Teachers of color provide a different perspective.
I was the only student in my classes whose mother was non-English speaking. Had some teacher actually reached out to me and said, hey, there are other kids like you, or hey, I was just like you, I would have felt more comfortable. But instead, I felt incredibly isolated. Teachers of color can actually reach out to students and make students feel included.
It doesn't necessarily have to be that teachers of color are placed in schools where there's a larger number of students of color. I think an educator of color dispels a lot of the myths and a lot of the stereotypes about who men and women of color are.
My experience of being a teacher of color in Oregon has been quite amazing.
Oregon is incredibly diverse, and we're really working together to make sure that all students receive a good education.
So I'm interested in knowing, we have some representation here in Middle Tennessee, Murphy City is in Rutherford, Murray County, which I'm familiar with. Murray, Dr. Marzak, good people. Hamilton County, East Tennessee. Are you also Hamilton County as well? Hamilton County, East Tennessee. Erin Glenn, y'all know Erin Glenn? She's in Hamilton. When you said that, I'm thinking Hamilton County. So obviously, this could look vastly different depending on where you are, right? What we just went over were some talking points, some suggestions, some ideas that could possibly implement it. It may not be streamlined, and it may not be the way it was stated up here, but it may be altered a little bit to fit your situation. And that's the situation, because I'm envisioning right now Tennessee, and it may not look the same. So I'm anxious to know what are some of the suggestions that we talked about, but also maybe some that we have not talked about that could be beneficial to your district or your school site in the district that we have not already discussed.
Okay, we talked earlier about money being an issue. Why not do a sign-on bonus? I meant to attract new teachers of color. It's working. You know, if you do it for your ELL teachers or your SLAD teachers, and you know there's a shortage, you need something else, try to take place.
There are, they frame it around subjects, but there are other states that do something similar, but I'm pretty sure they're probably selected with the candidates if they know there's a need for a certain body in the building. And I don't know is that a district decision to be able to say, hey, we want to offer a bonus?
In my district, it is.
It is. Yeah.
But Teachers of Color is a district issue in my district. So.
You have any thoughts on Murray County or within your building? What school are you at, by the way?
I'm at Whitthorne Middle School. I just got off the phone with our HR director yesterday and was trying to figure out a way for us to offer a position to a candidate of color who would have been a better fit for our students, from my opinion, right, from all of us on our administration team, because his personality would have been infectious, right, for our staff. He would have been, our second black male among a faculty of 75 when our students, make up about 35% of our students are African American, and he was the right candidate for the job. But because of discriminatory practices in the past, one of the watchdog groups for us would probably pull the records. You know what I'm saying? And the HR director said, I hear what you're saying, but he doesn't have a certification in the area that you want. You could request a waiver, but the problem is you have another qualified candidate on paper. You know what I'm saying? So I don't want to revert to a time where we would say, I'm gonna hire somebody of color who's not qualified, right, just to fit a quota. But at the same time, here was somebody who, personality-wise, was better qualified, but on paper he wasn't qualified for the job opening he had. And so we were unable to figure out a way around that, and are going to have to offer somebody else who will be fine, right, but it won't. Yeah. You know what I mean? So yeah. I don't think I just offered a solution. I probably offered another problem with that. But so that was really frustrating for me.
But I think that's realistic. That is a real life problem. That is something that's happening. That's probably going to happen in other schools and other districts. And people have to talk through that. They have to figure out, what does this look like? And unfortunately, the end result might be exactly that. We can't get this done right now. We're going to have to go with another candidate. But at least with the exposure of the issue, the takeaway is that, okay, I know this can exist. What are ways we can be forward thinking of trying to curve this a little bit for future revenue?
So I will say, I guess one other thing would be, if I were in your position and trying to increase the opportunities for people of color, their chances of getting hired would be to encourage them to choose specialties that are harder to fill. Mm-hmm. If I had a person of color apply for a Spanish position, I could hire him just like that, because you know what I mean? Or a special education, there are a couple of positions that would be a lot easier to fill, but then those more general ones are going to be sometimes more. There's yeah.
You about to say something? I heard that.
Yes, I was. I've been listening to this. All of you all are in administrative position. I'm not even teaching right now. But I have, for several years, I was a substitute teacher. And I took positions where I taught for a whole semester. I didn't get any credit for that because I had not gone through the program. And I worked at the telephone company at the same time. So I'm saying that maybe when you have a situation like that, I feel that a person that does that takes that time to do that, they're not doing it for the money. I did it because I wanted to be an assistant. helping with the students, and helping the school system as well, that could somehow be applied. I later went back and got my certification to teach elementary education, but none of that I did before that applied.
To that point, there's in Kansas City, Missouri, there's a residency program there that they intentionally target long-term subs and parapros. Because people who already have experience in the buildings, they already know the culture, they know the climate. Long-term subs have either done months at a time, a semester, or even a whole year. And what they've done is they've worked out a situation with and I can't remember the university, but they worked out a situation with the university where they can get credit for some of the work that they've done and then start training those individuals to be educators. So what you're saying makes a whole lot of sense. I actually had a friend in that similar situation. 2 years in a row was a long-term sub. Somebody got pregnant, had to leave, and I'm in a military community, so you could be there one day and get orders to leave and be gone in a couple weeks. And that was the situation. One person was pregnant, and then after she had a baby, she got orders to get stationed somewhere else. He took over the class from September for the rest of the year. Other time, beginning of August, school went in 2 days. Got the call, took over the class for the whole, and by trade, he has an English degree, and he was teaching English classes. Now, he didn't have all the mechanics down, as but he was making his way through. So with the help of teachers that were already in the building, and that the second year felt probably a lot easier than it did the first year. But the fact is, he was teaching the class. When they had the test, it was his responsibility. He had to own those test scores. He had to, set the climate and the culture of the building. And there are several people who are in those positions who, and I don't, that could possibly be a solution right there, just tapping into. It's a lot of people who are in the substitute program that have degrees, that have English degrees and math degrees. I know somebody in Memphis, a friend of mine, actually one of my fraternity brothers, he has a math degree. Been subbing for a long time. He just got hired at a charter school. I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but for a long time he had been, and there was a barrier for him because of a low GPA, trying to go back and get his licensure, and then there was something that had happened in his past that prevented him. But this was almost 10 years ago, undergrad now. I mean, also too, the other caveat is that at what point does, what happened or occurred or took place as far as for some people who have those barriers with GPAs getting into ed prep program, when is that superseded by your work experience and what you've done 10 to 12, 13, 14, 15 years after you matriculated from the program? It's a conversation that we probably need to address and have.
Which brings up another barrier that I discussed with her, age. Once you reach a certain age, they don't want you to say, I noticed in your presentation you talk about reaching the students that are coming out that are graduating in the education field. I did a whole 30-something years working for a company before I went back and got my certification to teach. Now, I taught for my elementary education, and I taught for a couple of years, but for one minor detail, and that was just passing one praxis exam. I went back and did pass it, but I have not taught since then in a school system. And I feel like that part of that, well, my spirit was broken for one thing, because after I taught for 2 years, I was not asked back. When I spoke to the state, they said, we'll talk to the principal, see if they'll take you back, or they didn't. So they wanted me to take a year off. In the meantime, I was not able to go back into that. I did some student teaching, and sometimes I do summer teaching during the summer. So that's a barrier right there. I'm thinking, I'll go back in my later years and take all the courses. I'm certified. I passed all my practice exams. But I know I'm gonna have a hard time trying to get back into the classroom.
I agree. I wish there was something in place where it was like, we can give you credit for or preferential recognition for service that you've already given. But I mean, as we all know, I mean, sometimes in education, it could definitely be sometimes a who you know game. And that is a very realistic reality. Like, some people are placed in front of administrators on the strength of relationships. I taught at the oldest school in my district. At one point, half the staff was alumni of the school. The school's over 100 years old, but that was the thing. Like, people were coming back, and those people were retiring. They were hiring recent graduates out of college. And these are people who had graduated from that high school. So, I mean, everybody who taught in my department were graduates of that high school at different decades over the years. So that's another thing too. And I don't know the navigation to get around that, but it's definitely something that just be brought in the atmosphere and addressed.
Incorporate something a program into the education department where when a person becomes a substitute teacher and they are doing those long-term jobs, and that they can be credited somehow, and then somehow kind of have a program to help them to go back and get certified if that's what they want to do.
I definitely, in my heart of hearts, I do feel like there is definitely an opportunity with long-term subs and parapros. Like those are populations that are people who they're in the building, they have a relationship with students, they probably are learning the community. Like that would be to get those individuals licensed. And again, the other caveat to that is that I know in my building there are several people who are subbing. They're either in school finishing up with a degree or they already have a degree. There's a population right there of people, they just need licensure. They need a program where they can just get licensure, and also, one that's not as that carries such a financial burden. Like, you shouldn't, you just want to be able to get your teaching license, and you already have your bachelor's degree. You shouldn't have to go to a $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 program to get licensure. It should be. I'm sorry.
Does a bachelor's degree need to be in education?
I not to be honest. I mean, just adding to the conversation, like, several of the alternate licensure paths, you don't have to have an education degree. They are going to certify you in a field, math, ELA, social studies. You already have the education requirement, the minimum requirement, and to get in many of those programs is to have the bachelor's degree. What we're doing now is just coaching you and training you how to be a teacher, developing you into a teacher, and then preparing you for licensure tests, the license certification. A program that was developed like that to address long-term subs who had degrees or parapros who had degrees could work wonders in this state. Could work a lot of wonders in this state, I think.
We have a program. Sometimes just establish a rapport with others, or just by word of mouth, that I'll know that maybe you are someone of color. But usually we have a process where it's called Search Solve, where I can have maybe 50 candidates apply for one job. So basically, you don't know the culture, you don't know if it's a person of color. You're skimming through every piece of this application process, but it does not state any of that personal information. So, so that's a process that we go through when we're looking for candidates, unless someone says, hey, I got a candidate you need to interview, and ask them to apply for one of your positions. But other than that, I'm searching through maybe about 50 candidates, and each one, if you really go through each one, it'll take maybe about a good 30 minutes for one. So we're spending a lot of time going through candidates, and of course that's what we should do.
Right.
But the process is tedious and it's long, but I'm willing to go through that to find a specific candidate. But still, after all is said and done, I've gone through 50 and not one can be one of color. Unless we call on the phone, and maybe you can detect in the voice, and sometimes you can't, or by the last name, but other than that.
And so these are realities that we're facing in the profession to try to address, just to try to reasonably and sensibly address this. These are realities that we're facing. And you know, this is just a start of a conversation. This is, I think, the thoughts and the ideas that we shared out today have hopefully affirmed that, you know, we have some great ideas to try to address the situation, but there are still barriers that are existing that we're gonna have to be creative and intentional about either addressing or trying to address to get around them or remove them completely to get people in buildings that look like the students that we're serving. This is a topic, a hot topic of conversation in the state. You know, they're about to start offering those diversity grants to districts to try to see if they can get creative with recruiting diverse candidates to come into the classroom. So again, this is not a exclusive list of, hey, this is the know-all be-all tell, but these are just ideas that we're sharing, and hopefully we'll be able to take some of these ideas and be able to tailor them in a way where it makes sense for our situations, whether it's just in our building or for our districts. So I would encourage those of you, especially in administrative roles and in classrooms in front of students, to continue to push the conversation forward and have those conversations. I think now even more than any time is much so needed. It's very much so needed because our makeup of students are getting blacker and browner. By 2024, by 2050, they're predicting that Hispanics will be the leading population in the states, and it won't be a huge disparity between ethnical makeups. It'll be pretty much kind of 25, 29. Everybody kind of tailor off in the sense where it'll be almost a level playing field. We're heading in that direction. And if we're going to be trying to develop students to be a part of this global society, we got to give them an opportunity to see what globalness looks like before they venture into the world. So I want to leave y'all with this is one I think sums up perfectly former Secretary of the Education, John B. King Jr., who's been to Nashville a handful of times over the last year or so. I'm just going to read it. And he made this statement, without question, when the majority of students in public schools are students of color and only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color, we have an urgent need to act. We've got to understand that all students benefit from teacher diversity. All students. We have strong evidence that students of color benefit from having teachers and leaders who look like them as role models, and also benefit from them regarding the classroom dynamics that diversity creates. But it's also important for our white students to see teachers of color in leadership roles in their classrooms and in their communities. So bringing this back full circle, I mentioned that I was an educator in an affluent community at the school that I taught at. I probably had maybe 1 or 2 students of color per period throughout the day. So maybe each school year I might have 8 to 10 students of color. But I learned so much from those students, and I know they learned so much from me. The comments that the gentleman made at the very beginning of the clip, in the beginning, we said a lot of students, and he was teaching a lot of students of color. A lot of those students said, hey, you're the first male educator of color, or the first male, or the first educator of color that I've had. I would get that all the time. I would get that all the time. These students had not seen a professional person of color in front of them. And I had the honor and the privilege of being the person to be placed in front of them for their tenure while they're in high school. And it was powerful and it was moving. And with that same lens, even though I'm an advocate of students of color, because I am a former student of color, I've lived that experience, but I am a firm believer that having educators of color is a win for all students across the board. And I don't think John King couldn't have summed it up any better. Thank you all for your time. And I have my contact information available. Again, I'm at the Nashville Teacher Residency now, be the recruiting director there. But also, too, another thing, I started a nonprofit organization called the Tennessee Educators of Color Alliance. That nonprofit birth out of the experiences that I had with the fellowships that I had. I began to start realizing that there just wasn't enough voice and presence available for educators of color. So we just recently got jumped off the ground. We received the equity grant from Conexión Americas that we are going to use as seed funding to shape the organization. But what we're doing is we're looking to connect with educators of color and also people who are committed to racial diversity in the education space here in Tennessee. And we are developing a shared voice for educators of color. We're starting here in Middle Tennessee, and we are working to expand to East and West. That's why I asked you if y'all knew Erin Glenn. Erin Glenn is in East Tennessee, but she actually serves on my steering committee. And we just had a planning retreat last Friday. But the goal for what we're wanting to do is by next year in the spring is to have a Educators of Color Leadership Conference where we'll be bringing educators of color across the state together to convene here in Nashville and to reveal a shared policy agenda and also what the next makeup of the future 2 to 3 years of our strategic plan will look like. So two things, if you know people or connected with people or, those windows and pots of people who know people who may want to be an educator, that's one thing. If they're an educator of color, that's even more icing on the cake. And then if you are a person of color that's in the education space or you are a supporter of racial diversity in the education space in Tennessee, I'd love to connect with you. This is a movement and work that involves all of us. It's not just Black people, it's not just Hispanic people, it's not just white, it's all of us collectively that recognize this as something that is growing and moving in a certain direction, and you wanting to help, and you want to be a part of that change that's going to make this better for children in Tennessee. Thank you all for your time.